We're very lucky tonight to have with us David Cole, Tressie McMillan Cottom, EJ Dion, Ellie Mastal, Representative Jamie Raskin, and Zephyr Teachout. So we have an opening question for each of them to say a little bit about, which is what are you seeing right now from your work that hasn't been captured by the media and public discourse right now? In other words, what's your take on the situation that hasn't been put out there yet, but needs to be?
I think the thing that I find missing in a lot of the discussion is hope, and I actually think there's a lot of reason for hope. Part of the reason I for hope that I find for hope is what happened last time. Donald Trump came into office. He had both houses of Congress, and he was unable to do most of what he wanted to do. He wanted to repeal Obamacare. He tried repeatedly in his Republican controlled Congress to do so. He failed. He imposed all sorts of restrictions on immigration. Many of them were declared illegal by the courts. He sought to put a citizenship question on the census. The courts stopped him. He sought to take away DACA protection from Dreamers. The courts stopped him. By the time he left office, at the midterms already, the Democrats won 41 seats and took control of the House. And by the time he left office, somewhat begrudgingly, he was a shamed person. So what troubles me is this kind of resistance. This mantra about how resistance didn't work. Resistance worked. And yes, people are tired. Of course, they're tired, and of course, they're despondent right now. But you can mourn for a little bit, but then you got to organize. And I have faith that people will, that we will push back, we will turn this around, and Donald Trump will leave office in 4 years, with his tail between his legs in much the same way, if not before.
There are a couple things that I hope will become more clear to people. Some things that I think are have become very clear to me. One, I was talking with some state operatives here in North Carolina over the last week. North Carolina has been and is continues to be a pretty liberal state at the moment. But I was talking to a Democratic operative who has done this for many years, and as despondent as he was with the overall results, he had two messages for me. He said, the takeaway here that somehow the Democrats didn't do their job is not exactly right. He said, I've been doing this for many years, and this is the first time that I have had the level of support that I had from both the national and the state Democratic Party to do our work. Tuesday, he drove around and 27 of the 29 precincts in Alamance County were organized, which means that they had a full slate of Democratic representatives welcoming people to the polls. But this local operative said, here's the thing, we voted harder. And nobody is giving us credit for that. He said the Democrats in this state and across the country voted harder. I said, well, then what happened? He said, well, Donald Trump's message cut through. And here's a little asterisk I'm going to put on this. I do think that something I hope that we'll talk more about over the coming weeks and months is what messaging looks like, not in this sort of, I think, simple sense that we sometimes think about in the discourse, which is who has a better slogan, who is sloganeering, who perhaps maybe is pandering, but what is the message that so many millions of voters did not hear in this election that resulted in the overall electorate actually shrinking? It just shrunk slightly less for Trump than it did for the Democrats with Harris Walls. But there are a lot of voters out there that did not hear anything that resonated with them. And I think that our lesson here for everyone, especially those of us in social institutions responsible for the social reproduction of those messages, myself in academia and in media, how can we do a better job with that messaging? I worry that we take the wrong message about away from this election about identities. Another word for identity is that voters care about things. So it is not that I think identity became a albatross for us this election. I think that some identities just won out over others, and with the elevation of white identity voters and white identity politics, we get a Donald Trump, but we don't always have to. And that is where I'll end there. I look forward to our discussion tonight.
I want to talk about the future, and I think one way to think about the future is looking at 2016, a different past, not the recent electoral past. When Trump was elected in 2016, a major part of Democratic resistance was joining forces with the hope that big business would save us. Google's CEO at the time joined the protests against the racist Muslim ban. Big tech, we went to big tech, both accusing them of perhaps using algorithms that enabled extremism, but mostly begging for them to, in the language that became popular in 2016, suppress misinformation and disinformation, a sort of new language set of the era, a language set that went hand in hand with a vision of alliance with big business. Because the vision was that if we could define that dangerous content and work with big business, then we could work to oppose Trump with this bulwark of big business. Disney's another example. We cheered on as Disney resisted Trump. Well, 8 years on, every CEO, whether it's Tim Cook or the CEO of Google or Zuckerberg, made calls before the election to make sure that they were going to be close with Donald Trump. Jeff Bezos's capitulation being the most sort of gross and obvious. And perhaps that's a response to Trump saying that he would jail Zuckerberg if he opposed him, or perhaps it's just an awareness that his bread is better buttered with a deregulatory juggernaut. But what we see is big tech joining forces, not just Musk, but across the board with Donald Trump. And Bob Iger of Disney, wholly silent. So what do we take from this? Well, here's the good news. That's the bad news. The good news is that is not a credible playbook anymore. It is not credible to, as a group of donors did last week, host a resistance strategy session with our friends at Google. Google is not our friend at this moment. What is credible is the anti-corporate economic populism message that won biggest across the country. Pat Ryan, who overperformed Vice President Harris by more than any congressional candidate in a swing frontline district, was running as an economic populist against big business that was screwing people over. That's also true for Marcy Kaptur, who just won her legendary seat back again, despite being gerrymandered into a seat that was designed to get her out of Congress for once and for all. And you see that with Josh Riley. You see that in, I think, an extraordinary op-ed by Antonio Delgado. And you see it in the young energy around the anti-monopoly movement, economic populism around the country. So the bad news is pretty bad. The bad news is we're not just against Trump this time, we're against Trump and big business, and it's a lot more, masks off. The good news is there is a growing, young, multiracial, energetic, economic populist vein within the Democratic Party that, if we give it the chance, can really build something exciting.
What I am hearing is the deep sense of betrayal from the Black community about what this country has done again, and frankly, what this country has done pretty much for the third time in a row. And there's a sense, from at least in my networks, that trying to save America from white folks is something that we are just about done doing, right? One of the reasons why Trump is here again is because the media failed so completely in 2015 and 2016 and never figured out why, never adjusted, never recovered, never had the soul searching necessary to figure out how they installed an open white supremacist rapist in office in the first place, right? There was never the self-reflection. There was never the recollection. That never happened in 2020 either. And it certainly didn't happen in 2024. So one thing that I guess I am particularly focused on in terms of going forward is what does journalism look like, or what does it need to look like going forward? Because everything that we've been doing hasn't frickin' worked at all. In fact, it has hurt. It has been bad. And I kind of feel like if you are a journalist, if you're in this Zoom, if you're here because you are a journalist, you are a writer, you are a reporter, you are a thinker, and you are not kind of deeply self-reflecting on what your value is in this society, and what your on what your purpose is in this society at this point, then maybe you didn't learn the lessons of the last 3 election cycles. Because certainly what I'm doing right now, what I'm spending all of my spare mental energy doing, is trying to figure out, what the hell am I supposed to do? What the hell is what the hell is my purpose? What is my function as the justice correspondent for the nation? Because whatever I've been doing, it ain't work. This is never gonna stop until the media takes some measure of self-reflection and responsibility for what happened.
First, words that should be repeated again and again, 14 words over the next 4 years. The words are, no person shall be elected to the office of the president more than twice. Those are the first words of the 22nd Amendment. And I think it is very, very important for everybody to realize and pound into everyone's head that Donald Trump will be a lame duck president on January 20th. And the reason I think that's important is twofold. Number one, he's already joked, and we know a Trump joke is a prediction of what he wants to do, that somehow there might be a way around that. Even Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito, I think, cannot get around the words more than twice. Doesn't say consecutive terms, doesn't say anything like that. And I think that it's to fight that, but it's also, I think, to undercut this idea of Donald Trump as this all-powerful president. And I think even Republicans who have been fearful from the beginning are going to start realizing that if they want a life after Donald Trump gets out of office, they may have to think differently. I think that coming to terms with the economic distress in the country, as Zephyr suggested in talking about trade, is really, really important. And it came home to me personally. I come from a mill town in Massachusetts called Fall River, which some of you may know. If some of you like driving to Cape Cod, you've driven through my town. Fall River is an old labor FDR Democratic town. Donald Trump is the first Republican candidate for president in 100 years to carry my dear town of Fall River.
We're already thrown back into this chaos with them, and we are going to try to, meet them in the House and meet them in the Senate and in the Supreme Court and all the other federal courts that we can. And we're going to have to fight to defend civil society. I was on the floor this morning fighting their rancid legislation to give the President of the United States, through the Department of the Treasury, the right to designate any 501c3 organization in the country as terrorist supporting. And then to notify them with a simple letter that the Treasury Secretary has designated you to be a terror supporting organization. You have 90 days within which to reply. You can say whatever you want, but if the answer is not convincing to the Secretary of the Secretary of the Treasury can simply decide that you are a terrorist supporting organization. That will constitute a final agency determination. At that point, you have the right to go to court. And then you have the burden of proving you're not a terrorist supporting organization. So this is obviously a complete capsizing of due process, a complete violation of First Amendment rights, and every Republican just voted for it. Most Democrats voted against it, but not all Democrats, I'm sad to say, voted against it, because simply putting the word terror or terrorist in legislation means you've got to vote for it. Right. And this is the idiocy that we're dealing with, that people really would not read it and say, well, just look at the title. I can't vote against that title. But we're going to have to suck it up and try to explain to people what's actually in these bills and what's in the legislation. And I don't think we should patronize the public or condescend to people by assuming that they can't understand this.